A Reading Life, hosted by Bart, Meehan and Rebecca Vassarotti. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Bart Meehan, and I'm here with my co-host, Rebecca Vassarotti. How are you going, Rebecca?
I am so well.
Well, our guest today is a marvellous Canberra writer, Freya Marske, and I want to read from the bio in one of her books. Freya lives in Australia, where she is yet to be killed by any form of wildlife. She writes stories full of magic, blood, and as much kissing as she can get away with. And she co-hosts the Hugo-nominated podcast, Be the Serpent. Her hobbies include figure skating and discovering new art galleries. And she is on a quest to try all the gin in the world. What a marvellous bio, and welcome to ArtSound, Freya.
Thank you very much.
Let's start your reading life at the very beginning. What were your first memories of reading?
I think I find it hard to pull apart my own memories from what I was told about my early reading life. I knew that I was lucky enough to grow up for a couple of years of my life in a house with a lot of older cousins who read to me while my parents were looking after my younger brother, who was still a baby. So we were in England for a year or so. And so I've been told over and over, oh, you just loved being read to. You got read the same books over and over. If they skipped a page or mispronounced something, you would correct them because you'd read them so many times. Couldn't read, obviously, but had memorized the books. And I know that I was reading from very young. I think the first book I remember picking up on my own and reading and retaining a memory of was Roald Dahl's Matilda. And I think for a 5-year-old precocious reading girl, Matilda is the ultimate book. And I remember bonding with a couple of other precocious 5-year-olds at primary school who had also read Matilda, and then we would fight over who got to be Matilda when we played it in the playground. But I think from there, from the age of 5, I was reading as much as I could, and my mum and dad obviously encouraged it, had a lot of books in the house, tried to get me into things that they had read when they were younger. And my mum did read to me and my brother before bed. I remember her sitting in my brother's bed, which was one of those little boy beds shaped like a racing car. He went through a stage of having that. And the two I most vividly remember her reading aloud to us were The Hobbit and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which we were a little bit too young to catch most of the jokes in, but there's something about the way that the prose is put together. You can tell it has the cadence of a joke, even if you can't quite get what the joke is. And enough of it's just silly language that we thought it was the funniest thing we'd ever heard. Yeah, I think I grew up in a house full of books.
So Mum and Dad were both avid readers?
Mum more than Dad. Dad does read. He reads mostly on long plane rides, of which he does a lot. But no, he's definitely a reader, and I think he was always just a bit more busy with work and read when he could. But my mum was definitely a very avid reader, came from a family of academics and avid readers, and carried that over to us.
The actual choice for The Hobbit and Douglas Adams, that was her choice? Or
that was her choice.
Okay, so is that the sort of genre she liked? She just loved the humour and the fantasy of those?
It's interesting. I'd never thought of her really as a science fiction reader, but clearly that was one that she had very strong associations with. I knew that she loved The Lord of the Rings, and she had always loved The Lord of the Rings. Not that she had read very, very widely in the fantasy genre, but that book in particular was a big one that she had an attachment to, and so she read us The Hobbit as being the age-appropriate one. I didn't read The Lord of the Rings until the first film came out. And I must admit, I didn't attach to it quite as strongly as my mum would have hoped. But I was already at that stage a very keen fantasy reader. And I think going back to The Lord of the Rings, back in terms of, when it was published, it was like seeing an origin myth for this genre that I'd already read so many books that had come down the lineage from Tolkien. And going back, I think as a young teenager, I found it a little bit slow, and I wasn't quite sure why there was all this poetry and all these stories about people who weren't even in the book, and come on, get to the action.
That's really interesting, actually, because my partner is a big science fiction reader, and he doesn't really, he had struggled with those as well. And I think it's, again, when you've been exposed to everything that was born from some of these early fantasy books, it's kind of a bit difficult to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, I think if I went back to it now, I think I would get a lot more out of it. And I keep thinking, I should go back and revisit Lord of the Rings. I'm sure I would get more out of Tolkien now, but somehow the TBR is just too long, and fitting a 3-volume tome of Tolkien that I know I'd have to take my time over has never quite managed to slide in between all the other things that I want to read.
It's interesting because Tolkien actually, as an academic, wrote Lord of the Rings. You mentioned the idea of an origin myth. He actually wrote origin stories to create Middle-earth. He created the languages and so on, and then a Lord of the Rings emerged from all of that early work that he did in creating this entirely different version of Earth. So what was the first adult book you read?
I think that's a tricky one, because I certainly, when I was going through high school, young adult as we think of it now wasn't as much of a big category. There were certainly some books I read that were very much aimed at young adults, both by Australian writers and other writers, but it was a very sort of new idea of that being a category. In most places, the library had the children's section. There might have been one teen shelf, and then you're expected to sort of march straight across to the adult section. So I think I probably made a fairly seamless jump from fantasy aimed at children. So I read a lot of the English classics like E. Nesbit's books, and I'm trying to think what else. I didn't read Diana Wynne Jones when I was growing up. I wish I had. I actually discovered her when I was in medical school. I think probably some of the really classic fantasy of that era, like fantasy by Sarah Douglas, the Australian writer, fantasy by David Eddings. So I sort of, knowing that I liked books about magic, I think I had a stepping stone in the form of some of Tamora Pierce's books. Like she had the series about the Lady Knight that began with Alana, the First Adventure. And of course, as a 12-year-old, the idea of a young, fierce girl who dresses up as a boy and goes secretly in her brother's place to become a knight, gets into romantic things, gets into adventures. Perfect for a 12-year-old who's into fantasy. And I think that was just my one stepping stone. And from there, I leapt off into the wilds of the adult fantasy in both the school library and the ACT library.
Okay. Were you an imaginative child?
One has to assume so. I certainly was writing from a fairly young age, even just little things. And I remember being quite into imaginative play. My poor brother probably got roped into quite a lot of things that he was not particularly interested in. But yeah, I think for me, creativity was always bound up in books and writing.
The school libraries have a checkered history about what they allow on the shelves. Was fantasy easily available?
Yeah, look, I went to Canberra Girls Grammar,
Right.
and I remember it having an amazing selection, heaps and heaps of fantasy. I think there was a shelf that you were supposed to be in year 11 and 12 to be able to get some books from, and that was more about the explicit sex than anything else. There was a wide range of fantasy in the main body of the library that probably had a bit more sex than
anyone
realised,
Probably
or
hadn't read
even
it.
just that it wasn't really the focus. I remember the Clan of the Cave Bear series quite notoriously was round the corner in the year 11, 12 shelves, and of course that made it forbidden fruit. Everyone was very excited to see what was in the books on the
First day of year 11.
First year
you were
11,
around.
let's go.
But really interesting that the books were there, and I think also lots of people bring particularly readers bring the experience of the librarian who actually knows that you're a ferocious reader and will actually let you into that section in a way.
Yeah, well, I think there was enough in the main section, and because I was almost exclusively a fantasy reader in my teens, it was all just about pattern recognition. You would just look at the shelf and be like, oh, there's a thick, fat 5-book series, and the colours on the spines make me think that's a fantasy series, and I haven't read it yet, but there's something about the way it's packaged. Almost nobody else was doing 5, 6, 7-book series, and I haven't read that one yet. That'll be my next go-to. And I just sort of ploughed my way through things and then revisited old favourites and reread them.
Were you a fantasy reader, Rebecca, when you were younger?
Not really. I remember actually starting to read The Hobbit to my brothers and sisters actually when on a school holiday. So I did a bit of that. Sort of, like some of those, and I'm just trying to remember the name of it, but some of those again, ones that had that really nice gender to mix up into the story of Camelot, but from the feminist perspective, and some of those things crept in. But not a huge fantasy reader in growing up, but my partner reads a lot of fantasy, so sort of will dip in and out. But I struggle a little bit with the very long series. Like
I do
dense
now.
books.
I think I'm amazed at what I managed to get through in my teens. I think now it's partly less time, but also just knowing more about what's out there. And I'm much more, I guess, wide-ranging reader now. There are much more genres that I read in, and so I can't just devote all my time to 7-volume tomes of fantasy. And it's interesting, it could have gone either way. I could have been one of those people who just happened across a relative store of romance books and got into romance very early, but I didn't get into reading romance until I was in my 20s. I didn't really get into reading literary fiction until probably my late teens, I think. So that maybe there was a few books through school, but also I was writing online and making friends online and being recommended books by people that I knew through writing communities. And so I started reading a lot of other things, either more sort of historical fiction, literary fiction, through probably about year 11 and 12 and then my early uni years.
It's interesting you mention romance as a genre, which is enormously popular, but not seen in a particularly strong light, certainly from a critical perspective. What drew you to romance? Was it the stories? Was it just being somebody who loved the idea of romance in a novel?
I like romance in stories, and it was pointed out to me by friends who knew the kind of things that I was reading, but also writing, because I was writing a lot online, writing a lot of fan fiction, which was quite a lot of it was romantic, that possibly I would enjoy reading romance. And of course, I think I had grown up with a bit of that internalized misogyny and that internalized, that's a silly genre for silly girls. And there's something I think very specific to the science fiction and fantasy community that is used to being looked down upon by the higher echelons of the literary community. And in turn, they turn around and say, well, at least we're not romance. There's still that gatekeeping, and we're still a bit better than the silly girls. And I had just sort of taken that on board, not quite consciously, I think, and didn't really think that I would enjoy romance. But luckily I had some friends who sort of slapped me upside the head with a couple of good titles and turned me onto it, and I had a great time and never looked back.
I think when people talk about romance, they quite inappropriately categorise it like Mills and Boon. And I would think, from a writer's perspective, writing good romance in a novel is not easy.
It isn't. And look, Mills and Boon writers are very talented. Writing a good romance in a short amount of time, and a Mills and Boon romance, they were produced quickly and they were short. And writing a satisfying short romance is a very particular skill, and I can't do it. I'm a very verbose kind of writer. I have to throw in the whole kitchen sink. And it's true, because I think people look down on it because they think, oh, it's predictable. You know how it's going to end. Every crime novel and procedural is going to end with the crime being solved. You know that going in. That's the promise of the genre. And that's why you read it, because you want to find out how that happens. Every romance, if it's marketed as a genre romance and it's been marketed correctly, you know going into it that these two people, or more than two people, depending on the romance genre, are going to end up happily together. You want to know why. And a good romance presents you with a situation and a handful of situations and two people and says, don't you want to know how these two could end up together? Doesn't it seem unlikely? Isn't there a lot stacked against them? Come with me on this journey. It's going to be fun.
I think that's the key word, isn't it? Journey. It has to be well written, because otherwise you won't take the journey.
Yeah. And if you look at some of the early literature, many of our very literary books that we think about today, they're romance.
Absolutely. And I think, and you were talking about one of your first adult books. It's true. I think Jane Austen was one of my first sort of big literary influences, and my mum was really keen on me reading those. And I think Persuasion was my first Austen, which is an odd one to be the first one because it's one of her more mature love stories. And I remember just being blown away because I hadn't done any Austen at school at that point. I think I did do Sense and Sensibility later as a school text as well. And I just found it so funny, and I loved the interior voice. And I think a lot of the fantasy that I'd read was very big on dialogue and action and world building, but I hadn't hit many books that had really slowed down and paid that much attention to interiority. And for me, that's one of the big appeals of romance, is that it pays so much meticulous attention to emotional life and thoughts and the context that a person grows up in and where their emotions come from.
Well, I must say, Jane Austen has been reasonably successful.
Oh, just
as,
a little
as a
bit.
romantic.
Yeah, and she's a huge influence on romance, capital R romance as a genre. There are romances brought out every year that are in one way or another a persuasion retelling or a Pride and Prejudice retelling, quite deliberately and named so that you recognise them. And it's not that you pick it up and go, oh, okay, it's just a retelling. You think, I love that story. I love the beats of that story. I love the bones of it. I want to see it with some slightly different flesh.
And of course, key in her work is character. I mean, it's really, really important, I think, in any writing to be engaged by the characters. If you're going on a journey with someone, you actually want to feel connected to them. Whether you hate them or love them, you want to be connected to them.
But it's also about relationship too. Like it's those characters, but also how they engage. Which is so important.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the reasons why I slid so easily towards romance was because I'd come to realise that character was really what I valued in a book. And I was never really a pure science fiction reader. And even when people started recommending me, oh, you love fantasy, you should try this science fiction, I bounced off quite a lot of it because I felt that the characters were fairly thin. They were there as vehicles for an idea. And a lot of people, I think, read science fiction for the ideas. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what some people really enjoy about the genre, really digging their teeth into the concepts. But a lot of people who write and read that, well, the characters are there. And they walk around and they say things and they do things and they move the plot along. But they're much less developed because they're there as vehicles for the concept. And that was less appealing to me. But I think a good character and a good voice for character is something that's so difficult to do well. One of my sort of school library reading memories is of Catherine Jinks, the Australian writer's series, the Pagan books, which are aimed probably about sort of late, I'm trying to think what they would be aimed at. I think the character's about 11 or 12 in the first book, and they're historical fiction set around the time of the Crusades, about a young boy who's half Arab who gets dragooned into joining the Templars as a squire. And it's obviously full of this rich medieval detail, or the details of the time that she knew from her work as a historical scholar. But it's told in first person, in Pagan's voice, and it was so funny. And you got this sense of this incredibly real, irreverent, scrappy kid just bouncing off the page and running around and having adventures in this very real time. And he noticed the grit and the smells, and he was made to do this stuff, and he had to go stay in a monastery, and it was so real, but it was so voicey. And if it hadn't been for that character and the way it was written, I don't think many kids would have picked it up, but I loved it, and lots of people that I knew loved it because it was such an easy and accessible way to get kids into historical fiction.
You mentioned before that friends pushed you towards literary fiction, and I think you said you were in your 20s before you really started to read literary fiction. What sort of literary fiction?
Ooh, I think Hilary Mantel, before she became known for the Wolf Hall books, wrote a book about the French Revolution called A Place of Greater Safety, which one of my friends, when I think we were about 17 at the time, was completely obsessed with. And she said, you have to read this. And it was historical fiction about real characters, about the real people of the French Revolution, but written in this incredibly engaging, it was Hilary Mantel, so the prose was wonderful, the characters were so rich, and their interpersonal dynamics were so interesting. So that was one that really stands out.
Are you attracted to historical or novels set in a historical setting?
Depends. I think I've read some that I love. Probably one of my favourite books is a historical novel, and then I've read some that I just sort of bounced off a little bit. I think if done well, the combination of character, and it really does, it's like fantasy, it immerses you in a different time and place. And if it does it well, then it gives you the same satisfaction of being immersed in someone's completely made up world. So one of my favourite writers of all time is Dorothy Dunnett, who was probably one of the greatest historical fiction writers ever. And the wealth of detail that she does, and the way she creates these incredibly vivid characters and moves them through this world that she's clearly researched to the utmost degree, to a point where you can't take it all in on a read. The Lyman series is 6 books, and they're all about 900 pages long. And of course, you wouldn't get through them without the characters.
Yes.
But there's also these incredible set pieces with these descriptions, and you think she must have a time machine. Like how can she evoke these places in such incredible detail using all your senses? So I really admire that in historical fiction. But if it doesn't have a story and characters that I'm immediately gripped by, I might bounce off it and try something else.
And a very difficult genre to work in, because many of your readers are actually know something about the historical period that you're writing in. So if you get an anachronism in the writing, they're usually fairly quick to point it out.
Yeah, well, as a reader, that doesn't matter to me as much because I never studied history. So I don't notice those. I'm not one of the people who's going to notice something and then send an email about it, really. As a writer of historical fantasy, I allowed myself a certain amount of what I called my anachronism budget because I was writing fantasy and not pure historical, and if anything, didn't quite line up.
But you're setting it in a sort of an alternate historical setting, aren't you?
More or less, it's the same setting. So most of my first 3 books are all set in Edwardian England, and everything about it is the same, apart from the existence of this magical society. But the politicians are the same. You know, the newspapers at the time are the same. The structures of society, non-magical society especially, are as close as I could get them. With the historical research that I'd done, but I didn't pull my hair out trying to make it exact, because I knew if you're writing fantasy, you get a little bit of leeway to tug at things in the name of story. If something wasn't going to fit, or if a word was perfect and I looked it up and I was a decade too early, I wasn't really going to fuss.
You said there you did research. How much research, for example, in your trilogy did you have to do before you started to sit down and write?
Ooh, before I started, not a great deal. I did a little bit of reading on especially the upper classes of Edwardian society, and that was fairly easy because it overlaps obviously with the late Victorian, and there is a lot out there about the upper classes because we have much more recorded things. Their clothes were kept, their menus were kept. We know about these grand houses because they are preserved, and so I could do quite a bit of research, and then once I had plunged myself in, it became much more about, I hit a thing that I needed to know about. What was the structure of the British civil service? What kind of jobs did women have in this civil service? Okay. All right. What did the underground look like at that point? And I just stopped and looked things up as I needed to. I didn't want to get too carried away with research and then find myself having to put details in for the sake of it. So I did enough to get a bit of flavour, looked things up as I needed them. And that was just for book 1. Once I hit book 2, I did have to do quite a bit more research specifically on the Titanic, because I was talking about a transatlantic voyage contemporaneous with the Titanic. And again, luckily, in quotation marks, not luckily for anybody aboard, but luckily for us as people interested in that area of history, because of what happened to the Titanic, every aspect of it has been impeccably documented over and over again. So it's quite easy to do research on what that kind of voyage and that kind of ship would have been like. And then when I hit book 3, I'd done probably enough about the upper classes, but I now had a working class protagonist and narrator for the first time. And so I went and did some very deliberate research, trying to find some primary sources on the lives of working class people in London at that time.
Before we talk a little bit, because that's a very good segue into your writing life, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about your reading life. We asked you before you came in to think about maybe 5 books that have stuck with you, have influenced you in some way in your personal or professional life. Can we go through that list?
Yeah, and I think we're just going to go through my top 5 favourite books, because I think to get onto that list, it has to have stuck with me. I have to have reread it a couple of times, and it would have to be very influential. I think if you held me to the wall, my top 2 books are probably pretty inseparable. I can never really decide one of them's 1 and one of them's 2. And they're very different. They are Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, who is an amazing British fantasy writer for young people. And I think most people now know Howl's Moving Castle because of the Ghibli adaptation, which was a fairly loose adaptation. But the book is one of my absolute favourites. It's just a perfectly constructed book. It's got a great romance in it. It's very imaginative. I read it when I'm sick. I read it when I can't sleep. I read it at least once or twice a year. It's a real homecoming of a book for me. And the other one is Regeneration by Pat Barker. That's another one that was recommended to me by a friend, and I didn't know anything about it going in, but they just said, Freya, I think you'd like this book. I think it's got some things about it that would appeal to me. And it just sent me head over heels down rabbit holes about World War One war poets, and at that stage I was in medical school, so the stuff about the history of psychiatry as a field, and especially war psychiatry, was absolutely fascinating. The way it weaves together real people and made up people, and just the elegance of the prose and how much emotion it conveys. I was completely blown away. And again, I reread that one all the time.
So that's 1 and 2?
That's 1 and 2. And then the other 3... So this one is a bit of a stand-in for the entirety of Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, which I think, again, I'm thinking back about the first adult book that I read as a kid. I read my first Discworld when I was 10, because I was given it for my 10th birthday by a very well-meaning friend who knew that I liked books and had clearly just gone to a bookshop and said, what do I give someone who likes fantasy books? And so I read my first Discworld book at age 10. And again, probably missed quite a lot of the jokes, because Terry Pratchett was a master of books with jokes that just... The more you read it, the more of them you notice every single time. And my favourite from the Discworld series is Night Watch, which is got time travel in it, and it's about revolutions. It's a very fond but quite cutting homage to Les Miserables, and it's got a great in it, about the role of the police state and the role of what it means to be a citizen and what it means to keep the peace. And Terry Pratchett was just an incredible social satirist, again, through amazing voice, through amazing character, through these really funny fantasy plots. And I think has become one of the most influential people in my, the way I think about what a book can do in terms of being entertaining, but also really making you think. So Night Watch by Terry Pratchett is definitely on my list.
So he is a marvellous writer.
I've read a few Discworlds, not a lot, but yeah, look, just fun, playful, but as you say, really cutting as well. So I'm not sure that I've read Night Watch. So again, this is why I'm doing this show, just so I can get some great books to read.
Excellent. Well, the fourth one, again, this is more of a playful one. This one is not cutting at all. This one is froth, but it is one of the best put together pieces of froth I've ever read. This is To Say Nothing of the Dog by Connie Willis.
Oh.
And so Connie Willis, as a sci-fi writer, was known for writing this series called the Oxford Time Travel series, about a world in which a very close future, which I think, going by her timeline, we are in currently. I think it might have been in the 2020s or 2030s that it takes place, where time travel has been discovered, and you're only allowed to do it if you're a historian as part of your research. And so the University of Oxford tightly controls time travel. And To Say Nothing of the Dog is a romp set in the late Victorian times at a manor house party, quite influential on me, and the books that I then wrote about somebody who is sent back at the demand of an unpleasant rich woman to find something that she's trying to restore and create a version of in the restoration of a cathedral. Except it's a real comedy of errors. It's a lot of things go wrong. There's mistaken identities. There's subplots involving kittens. There's people falling in love with butlers. It's like a Woodhouse novel, but it's got time travel in it. And again, it makes you think, but it's really just an amazingly fun time. And I remember I read it when I was on my rural GP rotation in medical school, and I picked it up because it was, I'll take this one with me. It's really thick. It'll take me a while to get through. I read it in an afternoon. I couldn't stop. I just sat in the backyard of the people who were hosting us and just read it cover to cover. And then thought, oh, that's all right. I'll just read it a few more times.
You're right. There are several in the series. She's again, another marvellous writer.
They're very tonally different. So I think if the only one you've read from the Oxford Time Travel series was that one, and you then picked up, for example, Doomsday Book, which is about the Black Plague. Yeah. Tonal whiplash, completely.
Yes.
Very depressing, very confronting. Yes. So if I have to reread them, I do Doomsday Book first.
And number 5? Number
5, Gaudy Night by Dorothy L. Sayers.
Okay.
So I love Dorothy Sayers' detective novels, her Lord Peter Wimsey novels. Somebody put me on to Sayers, and I read all the Lord Peter Wimsey books. The 3 of them that involve Harriet Vane, and Gaudy Night especially is a Harriet Vane book about the early days of women in academia at Oxford, and about the role of women in a changing society and the attitudes towards them, and how people carved out these identities when they were really expected to be either wives and mothers or these unnatural academic spinsters.
That was part 1 of our conversation with Freya Marske. Part 2 will be broadcast next week. Until next time, take care and be well. You've been listening to A Reading Life Produced by ArtSound FM, Canberra's best community station. ArtSound FM is a community-based radio station. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider being a member. Go to our website at artsound.fm for details.